So I wanted to introduce Peter Bronson, and forgive me using my phone. I forgot my paper copy that has his book biography on it. So Peter is a newsman, an editor, magazine writer, author, and owner of Chili Dog Press Publishing. He's written 9 books, including The Man Who Saved Cincinnati, Promised Land, Not in Our Town, and Forbidden Fruit. He was the editorial page editor and columnist for the Cincinnati Enquirer for nearly 20 years. And under his leadership, the Enquirer was judged best editorial page in Ohio for 4 years in a row. Pardon me. Before coming to Cincinnati in 1992, Peter was the editorial page editor and columnist at the Tucson Citizen in Tucson, Arizona. He started his career in Michigan after graduating from Michigan State University in his hometown of East Lansing. Peter has 2 sons, and he and his wife Kathy reside in Milford. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Peter Bronson.
Anyway, so one of the great surprises to me is how much wonderful, rich history there is in Cincinnati, right here in our own backyard. And there's so much of it. It's just been a real pleasure for me over the recent years to research and tell these stories. And I hope that this instills some real pride in our sense of place here in Cincinnati. And also we learn a few things maybe we didn't know, or maybe we set some stories straight that we thought we knew. So we start, let's see, there we go. We start with, to put this in context, I'll be talking about all of my books very briefly, but then we'll focus on our time. But to start with, to put it all in context, is Forbidden Fruit. And this is a book about the 40-year empire of organized crime in northern Kentucky. When I first heard about this story, when I came to Cincinnati, I thought, yeah, it was probably just some punks who thought they were mobbed up in northern Kentucky and Newport. But no, this was the big-time mob. It was the Cleveland Four, and they ran everything in northern Kentucky. They had everybody in their pocket, from the beat cops to the judges, the prosecutors, the elected officials. Everybody was in the hands of the mob in those days. There we go, I'm getting the hang of it. So this is how the mob really got going in America. It was the Volstead Act of 1920. That was prohibition. And up till then, the mob was really confined to little slivers of the East Coast and in big cities like Chicago. There might have been a little bit in Cincinnati, but it was prohibition that really gave the mob its opportunity to go nationwide and to take over enclaves and franchises, if you will, in every city. And the Cleveland mob got the franchise for Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky. As you know, Prohibition was repealed in 1933, but by then it was too late. The mob had figured out there's this huge demand for something the public wanted, and they were going to get it one way or another. Well, what people soon discovered is that when they went to the mob for their bootleg booze, they were also asking the mob to bring in a lot of other things like prostitution, gambling, drugs, corruption. Corruption was a cancer. And it was started by this man, George Remus, who came to Cincinnati, and he became the king of the bootleggers, but not just in Ohio. Often we think that was just in Ohio. No, he was the national king of the bootleggers. He was supplying bootleg whiskey to the East Coast, to Chicago. He had the ideal spot, which is still Cincinnati, because we are so centrally located, for easy routes and delivery paths to service everybody on the East Coast and in the Midwest. And he was kind of a genius in his own way. He figured out that as soon as Prohibition passed, all these huge warehouses of liquor were just going to be sitting there. So he got the license to buy those for nickels on the dollar, and he began selling it as medicinal purposes. And he made a contract with Walgreens, of all people, which was just a little tiny drugstore chain, and they really rose to their big national prominence because they were selling bootleg liquor as medicine. In the 1930s, this is what the Beverly Hills Country Club looked like. It was a showcase of the nation. It was really a fantastic club. All of the big names on Broadway, in New York, and in Hollywood were coming there to perform, and this was the place to be. And these days, Las Vegas was on the Ohio River in Newport. There was no Las Vegas. So Newport was Vegas before Vegas was cool. This is what the Beverly Hills Country Club looked like in the 1930s. This looks pretty cool right now. I wouldn't mind going there. And it looked so good, in fact, that the Cleveland Four Mob came down and took a look at it. Their boss, Mo Dalitz, he came down and looked at it, and he said, I've got to have that club. That's in my territory. So he told Pete Schmidt, who was a gangster for George Remus. After George Remus went to prison, Pete Schmidt took over Newport because the infrastructure for corruption was already there, and he didn't have to start it all over. So he took over the infrastructure, and this club was big time into gambling. So they were an illegal casino, but it was right out in front of everybody. So Mo Dalitz comes down and says, I'll make you a deal, Pete. You can, I'll buy you out or I'll burn you out. And Pete Schmidt said, no deal. I guess The Godfather hadn't been written yet, so he didn't know that was an offer you can't refuse. And this is Mo Dalitz, and he was a smart guy. The Cleveland mob was also known as the Silent Syndicate because they stayed with a low profile, whereas Al Capone was swaggering through Chicago and perpetrating things like the Valentine's Day Massacre. That attracted so much attention from the feds that it made all the other mobsters nervous. And so Mo Dalitz was smart. He said, well, let's just keep us low profile and we'll stay out of this spotlight. But here he is at the Kefauver hearings. In the 1950s, Estes Kefauver, a U.S. senator, decided to launch a nationwide tour of hearings to find out and expose the huge reach of organized crime in all of our communities and cities. It was symbolized by that octopus on the cover of Time magazine, which shows prostitution, horse racing, drugs, police corruption, everything you can think of that the mob brings to your community. That's what Estes Kefauver exposed. And these hearings were so popular, it became the first really big television event in our country. Anywhere, actually, because television was still just a brand new thing. And people would actually have parties after work to watch these hearings on television. One little trivia fact for you. One of the people testifying was the Prime Minister of Crime in New York, and he had laryngitis when he testified. And when he testified, his voice came out very gravelly. That was the voice that Marlon Brando adopted for The Godfather. He actually took it from the Prime Minister of Crime. This was the man who was the enforcer in Newport. His name was Red Masterson. He admitted to a reporter in Lexington that he killed more than 100 people. Usually he did this with a pair of .38s that he carried, but occasionally if he wanted to send a message, he would do what they called the Newport nightgown, which was to tie you up in chains and then throw you off the suspension bridge. That was his nightclub, his gambling casino called the Merchants Club, and that was almost next door to the police station in Newport. So it was not like this was any big secret. In 1960, the people of Newport and Fort Thomas and Covington all got really tired of having the mob run everything and corrupt their city, so they formed what they called the Committee of 500. It was primarily Protestant churches. It was mainly Protestant churches because the Catholics wouldn't join. And the reason the Catholics refused to be part of the Committee of 500 is that they were worried that if gambling was outlawed, it would take away bingo. Untrue. So the Committee of 500 recruited this man, George Ratter, and that's his card when he played at Notre Dame. He was a fantastic quarterback at Notre Dame, a fantastic athlete. He was also kind of a party guy. He came back to Cincinnati after his illustrious career in pro football, and he became an investment counselor. And the Committee of 500 said, hey, here's a guy, George Ratterman. He comes from a well-known family, very respected family in Cincinnati. Let's see if we can run him for sheriff. And they did. And he became so popular, he was having rallies of 10,000 people in Newport would come to his rallies. And that made the mob very nervous. So they hatched a plot. The lawyer at the middle of that plot was a man named Charles Lester. But his front man was the guy in the sunglasses in that newspaper picture, and that's Tito Carinci. The funny thing is these guys both played football. One of them played football at St. X. The other one played, I think they both played at St. X. And Tito Carinci set up this deal where they would invite George Radaman to the Hilton, and they'd serve him drinks. And by his own testimony later in court, George Radaman admitted that he had 11 scotch and sodas during that little afternoon happy hour. And somewhere along number 10, they slipped him some knockout drops. And they hustled him across the river and put him in bed with a stripper whose name was anybody?
April Flowers.
April Flowers, yes, that's right. Her real name was Juanita Hodges. And the interesting thing I found out about Juanita Hodges is that she actually became one of the heroes of this story, because when Newport was so corrupt that they couldn't convict these mobsters of framing up George Radaman, she's the one who flipped and started testifying about this plot. And the reason the plot was blown up was because after he was caught in bed, coming out of the strip club, it was called the Tropicana, where Tito Carinci ran the club, and they put her in bed with April Flowers, and he came down the next morning in the custody of police, and it looked like his reform candidacy has just been destroyed. But he got a blood test, and the blood test showed the chloral hydrate, knockout drops, and after that, there was a huge backlash against the mob. However, it was almost impossible to get a conviction against the mobsters because Newport, all of their judges and prosecutors were so corrupt. So Bobby Kennedy, who was the brand new Attorney General, hears about this, and he sends his right-hand man, Ron Goldfarb, to Newport to clean up the mob. And there's another little point of history, which is that the Kennedy brothers declared war on organized crime in Newport, Kentucky. And organized crime, including Sam Giancana, who claimed that he got Jack Kennedy elected with voter fraud in Chicago, they thought the Kennedy brothers were in their pocket. So when Bobby Kennedy declared out war on the mob in Newport, that was a huge surprise to the mob, and it resulted in a vendetta that ended up costing both brothers their life. Now, after Ron Goldfarb and Bobby Kennedy fumigate Newport and chase the big boys from Cleveland and New York out to Las Vegas, where everything goes, this guy took over. That's Screw Andrews. And he's seen here beating down a photographer because George Radaman showed up to serve a warrant, and he couldn't slug the sheriff, so he decided to beat up the photographer instead. Screw was a really nasty piece of work. He ran all the numbers rackets in Cincinnati. He ran all the brothels in northern Kentucky, and there were lots and lots of them. One reporter counted more than 300 prostitutes in 1 mile. And so he ran all that business, hence the nickname Screw. He was also, the funny story is that when Bobby Kennedy puts him on the 10 most wanted list for organized crime figures in the country, he told his staff, finally we have somebody who's not Italian. And they said, sorry sir, his real name is Frank Andriola. He was very Italian. So there's Radaman trying to serve a warrant, and he comes out when he's trying to serve the warrant, and guess what's on his car? His sheriff's car has a ticket from the Newport police. And they're letting him know who's boss in Newport. When George Radaman was finally elected sheriff, he had to hire a whole new, what he called his own untouchables, deputies. Because when he went to the county judge executives and he asked them why they were paid practically nothing, they said, well, the mob's already paying them, why should we too? Why should we pay him too? And so he said, okay, all of you guys are fired. I'm going to hire untouchable deputies. And he did clean up Newport for a while. However, then we had what happened was a period of disorganized crime when the porn industry moved in. In the 60s, the mob began to move from bootleg liquor and gambling to prostitution more intensely, nightclubs with topless dancers, dirty movies, adult bookstores, all of what we used to call the sin strip. And every city had one. And in 1970, the FBI did a study and they said 95% of all the adult businesses in the United States are owned and operated by the mafia, by two big organized crime families. Which, you know, at the time, if you were reading the newspapers, you would have believed that this is a victimless crime and it's just what people want to do and there's no harm in it. Not true at all. And this is important as we get to the next chapter, which is not in our town. So when all this is going on in Newport, what is going on in Cincinnati, you may ask? Well, there was a pretty intense battle going on behind the scenes by certain police people, police officers, and certain leaders in the community to make sure that the mob stayed on the south side of the Ohio River. We had an unwritten rule, which is, okay, we've got our adult playground over there, and that's where we can go get our bootleg liquor and our adult entertainment and all the nightclubs and casinos, but we don't want that in Cincinnati. It was kind of a neat deal for Cincinnati because we sold conventions as a family-friendly city, but then there was kind of an elbow in the ribs like, hey, if you want to have a good time, come on over to Newport. And one of the guys who kept Cincinnati clean is this man on the left. His name is Bob Meldon. He was Detective Bob Meldon, but his nickname was Machine Gun Bob. And in the left side, he looks like a really friendly guy. We'd be glad to have him in your neighborhood, but then when he gets a Thompson submachine gun in his hand, look out. So in this picture, which became one of the award-winning pictures for the entire United States that year, there was a man who was holed up in a coal cellar downtown, and he had a gun, and he had fired it at a police officer. And Bob Meldon was called to clean him out of there. And he came up with his Thompson, and he fired at least more than 100 .45 caliber slugs into that coal cellar, and the guy was hit once and came out glad to surrender at that point. And then this is a picture on the left. It looks like a scene from The Godfather, perhaps, but that is in fact Cincinnati police detectives carrying Thompson submachine guns and shotguns because that's what the mob was carrying. And that is the Vice Squad, by the way. On the right, the man with the very short haircut in the foreground is the father of our former police chief, Tom Stryker. That is Tom Stryker's father, Tom Sr., and Tom Sr. was a sergeant in the Vice Squad. But a funny thing happened in the early 70s. The mob was moving in with all kinds of porn activity into Cincinnati, opening adult stores. There were probably some in your neighborhood or in this community. They were all over the west side, downtown, and the problem was, when you tried to close them down, the mob had so much money that they would just fly in New York lawyers, a plane load of them, and just slow things down, and it would take forever. So people finally got sick of this, and they were just fed up with the legal process, and they kept being promised, oh, we'll take care of it in the courts, but nothing ever happened. Well, suddenly there was a spate of 25 of these adult bookstores had their windows shot out during a 1-month period. And nobody could figure out what was going on until one night, downtown in Cincinnati, a couple of beat cops or patrol officers are downtown and they hear some gunfire. They follow it to the scene and they find that one of the adult stores downtown has just had its plate glass windows blown out. Well, as they were getting there, they see a car going the other way and they recognize the car. It was one of the unmarked cars that was used by the Vice Squad. And the people that were shooting out those windows were Tom Stryker Sr., members of the Vice Squad, and a Catholic priest. And they were going out on a Saturday night having a few drinks, and then they would go around and blow up these adult businesses. And the way Tom Stryker Jr. explained to me, his father told him, I know what these people are like. They hurt children, and they're not doing it in my damn neighborhood. Not in my town. That's what he said. Well, he was a veteran. He raised his kids. He was a Little League coach and all the rest, and he just was going to make sure that these guys got the message that that wouldn't happen in Cincinnati. Unfortunately, it escalated from there, and it went up higher up the ladder, and this man on the left got involved. Anybody recognize him? That's Charlie Keating. Okay, Charlie Keating, before he became famous as the personage who was the poster face of the savings and loan meltdown in the early 90s, if you remember that, the Keating Five, that was Charlie Keating. But before that, he was the guy who formed something called Citizens for Decency Through Law. And that was an organization that got very powerful, not only in Cincinnati through the church, the Catholic Church primarily, but also nationwide. Almost every city had a chapter of this, and about 80% of the members of Congress were on his letterhead. And the reason was he also figured out that when he tried to close down an adult movie theater, the mob flew in their plane load of lawyers, and they would just completely slow you down, and there was nothing you could do to enforce your own local municipal's ordinances for decency. So he formed what he called a SWAT team of lawyers that were trained up to go all over the country and defend the decency laws in municipalities. They started in Ohio, but they spread all over the nation. And believe it or not, their success rate of defending those decency codes was 95%. So it showed, he proved, that yes, you can defend your decency laws, but you really have to specialize in it and know how to do it. And when he did that, of course, that made him public enemy #1 to organized crime, because this was a huge multi-billion-dollar, hundreds of millions of dollars from the adult industry that they're making. So they put him on their hit list. Later on, Larry Flynt came to town, and he was the face of the mob. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the mob hated him so much, Larry Flynt announced publicly that he would offer a huge reward to anybody who would kidnap and rape Charlie Keating's daughters. And in fact, it did happen, and that's in the book as well. Now also, at the same time, Simon Lease is the prosecutor, and that's Fred Cardellano, and he's also working to try and keep Cincinnati clean and decent. And during this period, the mob was everywhere. I was surprised to stumble across this story in Life magazine about Jim Rhodes in 1967, in which it was, all of the pieces were there that added up to him being paid a huge amount of money by the mob to offer a pardon to the Licavoli. There was a guy who was Yanni Licavoli, and he was in prison in Ohio. And the mob put out notice that they would pay $300,000, which is a lot of money in 1967, if anybody could get him a pardon. And what do you know? Guess what? Jim Rhodes pardoned him. And it blew up in his face. But there were a lot of, that story was all about how the governor of Ohio was in cahoots with the mob. And this was not a rare story. It was happening everywhere. So then we get to Larry Flynt, who shows up in town in the late 1960s, early 70s. And the story he always liked to tell was that he was a really smart entrepreneur and a businessman genius. And he started with a little bar in Dayton, and he turned it into this huge hustler empire of magazines and nightclubs. Well, none of that's true. He bankrupted 11 bars in Dayton. That's what a good businessman he was. And then suddenly one day he shows up in Cincinnati with a huge bankroll of $800,000. And that's how he opened his hustler club. And that money came from the Cleveland mob. He was mobbed up all the time. He was just the front man for the mob in the porn industry. And here's Larry Flynt in his glory, because he's surrounded by the press. During those years, he was almost a hero to the working media, because he always portrayed his battle as if it was about the First Amendment. It was not. It was really about Larry Flynt, and it was about porn. But he was played up as some kind of a hero. And the story is that Cy Lease actually convicted him on 3 charges in 1977, and those charges were pandering, obscenity, and organized crime. We may remember the pandering and obscenity part, but a lot of people forgot. That was organized crime, and he was convicted by a Hamilton County jury. Larry Flynt got his start in Newport, right back to sleazy Newport. And his mentor, if you will, was a woman named Mom Raleigh. And the Raleighs were the people who ran the Brass Ass and the Brass Mule, and a bunch of other topless bars and strip clubs in Newport. And that's where Larry Flynt really got his start. In those days, Newport was Cincinnati's sin strip. There were sin strips all over the country in the 70s. Every town almost had one, any town of any size. And that's where Larry came up through that, and he was sponsored, and had his launch pad from Mom Raleigh until he got his money from the Cleveland mob. Now, the other big story in 1977 was the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire. Now, put this in context. These are stories 1 and 2. Number 1 in 1977 was the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire. 165 people killed that night. And the other story, of course, was Larry Flint being arrested and convicted in Hamilton County. And the reason that one was so huge was because the national media chose to fight its war in Cincinnati, and they made Cincinnati out to be the laughingstock, the backwards hicks and bumpkins who were too conservative, too square, too Catholic, and just couldn't get with the times and accept that porn was the new cool thing. And it really was that way. So you had these two huge stories, and Cincinnati, in some ways, I'm not sure it ever recovered from that. The next day after the Supper Club fire, here we have a picture that shows the zebra room where the fire originated, and we also can see that the clamshell crane is destroying evidence on what a fire official that I interviewed, who was a fire marshal at the time, called. He investigated this and he called it the biggest mass murder unsolved cold case in U.S. history. And you can see that the zebra room was the first place destroyed. The evidence was covered up, and there's so much evidence of arson that this was deliberately set, but you'll have to read the book to find out all of it, because we're going to focus back on the other one. And so we go to another, there's our illustrious mayor in Cincinnati, Jerry Springer. You remember the story, right? Yeah. He bounced a check to a prostitute. How stupid is that? Well, as he put it in his press conference, and I looked it up, he came out and he had his press conference and he said, I went to a health club once and I made a mistake. He was newly married at the time. And it was my mistake, and I'm sorry, and it'll never happen again. Well, it wasn't a health club. It was a sleazy motel in northern Kentucky, and he was a regular, so that, I mean, he was such a regular that they took his check. No cash for you, Jerry, we know you, until the check bounced. And the story I got from Silas was that he and Sacco Wheatley, who was the chairman of the Democratic Party at the time, went to Jerry Springer and said, look, this is just an embarrassment. We'll make a deal. We won't pursue the charges if you will agree to resign from public office and leave town. We'd really like it if you just leave town. And Jerry Springer said, sure, where do I sign? Well, of course, we know how that turned out, right? He agreed, but then he runs again for council. He's reseated on council, and then he actually got the most votes in that election that came up next, and he became mayor. And then he went on to his career as a schlock on TV. But Jerry Springer was quite a character. One of the things, as somebody who wasn't here in those days, I find it hard to believe this, but there was actually a letter to the editor in the Cincinnati Enquirer during this period after he'd been caught bouncing a check to a hooker. And this letter to the editor said, and it wasn't kidding, that Jerry Springer is a paragon of ethical and moral virtue, who should be held up as a model to our future generations. Yeah, I don't get it. He must have had some kind of charm for some people. And then we go to another story, which is the serial killer Joseph Paul Franklin. Now you may remember Larry Flint was shot in 1978 while he was in a trial for pandering obscenity. And the man who shot him, we eventually found out, was this man, Joseph Paul Franklin, who was there on the right, who was an unbelievably evil man. Joseph Paul Franklin, before he shot Larry Flint, shot two boys in Avondale, here in Cincinnati, in 1975, killed them both. He actually sat up on that railroad trestle that you can see in the background. There's the bloodstains of those boys right there. And he would shoot them, and he had a method for doing this, and he would shoot one, and then, like if he saw a man and a woman walking together, he would always shoot the man first, because he said it was his experience that the woman would hang around and try and help him, and then he could shoot her too. Whereas if he shot the woman first, the men would run. He knew his business, and he killed a lot of people. Well, he was finally caught, thanks to Cincinnati police primarily, although the FBI tried to take all the credit for it. It was Cincinnati police detectives who finally caught him, and the way he was caught was that he was wearing a tattoo. He had all kinds of tattoos with swastikas and really creepy stuff, and he went to give blood in Florida to finance his continued serial killing spree. And one of the people that was doing the phlebotomist who was taking his blood, saw that tattoo and recognized it from a flyer. And that's how they caught the guy. He was prosecuted by Joe Dieters, and that was our most recent former prosecutor, Missy Powers. And she was the one who took his confession in a cell in Missouri where he was on death row. And she took the confession for those boys who were killed. And she describes that experience in the book, and it's nothing short of chilling, I'm telling you. This guy was pure evil. He was about as dark as you can get. Then we get to another story, which is after Larry Flynt is shot, he loves to come back and torment Cincinnati at every opportunity. He would go on to Fountain Square and pass out Hustler magazines, just daring anybody to prosecute him so that he could get more national attention and more adulation from the media about this great First Amendment battle that he's fighting. Well, during his later years, it's almost impossible to overstate what a sleazebag Larry Flynt was, but here's how bad he was. He hired this guy, Mitchell Werbel. Mitchell Werbel was a CIA spook. He ran a training ground for CIA spooks. He was the guy who used to go to the banana republics and overthrow their governments. He would assassinate foreign leaders. He was a trained assassin, a soldier of fortune. He would do just about anything. Well, Larry Flynt hired him as a bodyguard. And when Larry Flynt was in the Supreme Court on an obscenity case, surprise, right? So he's in the Supreme Court on a daily basis on this landmark case on First Amendment and obscenity. And Larry Flynt hired Mitchell Werbel and wrote him a check for $1 million to pack his gold-plated wheelchair with plastic explosives. And Larry Flynt was going to put on a vest full of needles. And he was going to detonate his wheelchair and assassinate the entire U.S. Supreme Court. And this is all part of the FBI records. You take a look in the book, you'll see the originals in there. And believe it or not, Mitchell Werbel said no. Mitchell Werbel said, yeah, I'm an assassin, I'm overthrow governments, but I draw the line at assassinating the U.S. Supreme Court. So he tipped off the Secret Service, and he tipped off the FBI, and they stopped it before it could happen. There was a big scene in the court. Larry Flynt was hustled out of there, and it was avoided, thanks to that guy who wouldn't be your first choice as somebody who would stand up and do the right thing, but he was. And then later in life, well, at his death, Mitchell Werbel, because he did this to Larry and Larry found out about it, he swore with his dying words that Larry Flynt killed him. He was at a cocktail party that Larry Flynt was sponsoring, and he invited Mitchell Werbel. And right after the cocktail party, Werbel got seriously sick and checked into a hospital where he died of heart failure. And he insisted to his best friend as he was dying, Larry Flynt killed me. And it's probably true. So maybe some of you remember the days when Cincinnati had its own Playboy Club. Yeah. So that's another story in here about how that happened. And this was to the gentlemen of Cincinnati, thank you for being such loyal customers at our Playboy Club. I don't think those would be very popular anymore. And then we take a look at what happens when the mob moves into your town. What happens is corruption. And one of the worst of it is the police corruption. So back in the days before Larry Flynt came to town, when Cincinnati was still keeping the mob on the south side of the river, we had this police chief, Stan Schroetel, whose department was so good and so clean it was held up as a model to the entire nation by Life magazine. And then just a mere 6 years later, Larry Flint comes to town, and we had one of the biggest police scandals in our local history. What was happening? Does anybody remember Police Chief Carl Gooden? Okay, Carl Gooden was so respected, he was on the very, very short list at the top of the list to replace J. Edgar Hoover. He was actually going to become the new FBI director. And then one day, Cy Lease heard from a whistleblower that they were having stag parties at downtown hotels, and that Carl Gooden and all the top brass of the Cincinnati Police Division are attending these stag parties that are serviced by girls from Larry Flint's Hustler Club. And they were being delivered to the stag parties by the Cincinnati Vice Squad. This was a huge scandal, and it really tore the town apart for a while. But you can see what happens in that period between having one of the best police divisions in the country to going through that. There's also a chapter in here that I think many of you will find pretty delightful when Tom Stryker talks about what it was like when he joined the police in his rookie days in the 70s, and the crazy amounts of under-the-table corruption and things that were going on. It's really pretty fun. And then there's a story within the story in this book, which is the decline and fall of the newspaper business. When I started my newspaper career in the 70s, this is what the Enquirer newsroom probably looked like. I wasn't there then, but it would have been somewhat like it was when I got there in the early 90s. More than 100 people in the newsroom. Everybody's on the phone. They're writing stories. The computer keys are clicking, or the typewriters are clackety-clacking, and everybody's just having a blast, arguing with your editor, writing the story, telling them about it. The last time I was at the Enquirer office was when I was preparing research for Not in Our Town, and I went up and it looked like that. It was dark. All the chairs were pushed to the middle. There were actually only 3 people in the newsroom, and one of them was the receptionist, and one of them was the archivist, the librarian, who was there to meet me, or he wouldn't have been there at all. There was only one reporter in the entire Enquirer. It's a sad thing. Part of it is our changing culture and our technology and the way we get our news now from phones and computers. But another part of it goes back to the first part of the story that I was telling you, where the media had, and has had for a long time in my career, almost an uncanny ability to pick the wrong side. To side with Larry Flint in a town like Cincinnati that was valiantly fighting for something we believe in, which is a decent, clean town to raise your children. And yet, Cincinnati was painted as being the bad guys for trying to enforce decency laws. And the media took Larry Flint's side in most cases. I went back and read a lot of articles, so I don't say this from just off the cuff. But there was also another problem that happened through this period that I tell from a story within a story of an imaginary, it's the Enquirer newsroom, but with imaginary people who are kind of composites of people I worked with. And what happened was everything became increasingly political. Every story had an agenda, and every group they were like splinter groups all through the newsroom had a cause. And that cause was always ahead of objectivity, fairness, and telling the news as the way it should be, in my opinion. So that's a story within the story. Now, just a word about a couple other books that I brought with me tonight. This one is about the man who saved Cincinnati. General Lew Wallace was the youngest general in the Union Army at the time in 1862. And he was an amazing man. In Indiana, he's pretty much known to all the school children because he's the biggest hero in Indiana history. Here in Cincinnati, he saved Cincinnati. He was known during the Civil War as the savior of Cincinnati, and we don't even know about him. Not only did he rescue our riot-torn Panic City when we were on the brink of surrender. You see, our mayor was named George Hatch, and he was a Copperhead Southern sympathizer, and he wanted to surrender to the Confederates. The Confederates had sent an army of 10,000 battle-hardened veterans up to take Cincinnati, to burn it, to loot it, to take all of the supplies and the money from our banks. We were the 6th largest city in the country at the time, about twice as big as Chicago, 6 times bigger than Columbus, 4 times bigger than San Francisco. We were a big city, and we had a lot that the South desperately wanted for their army. So he came, General Heath, the Confederate general, came marching up here and got as far as Fort Mitchell. And he's there, ready to loot Cincinnati, and our mayor wanted to surrender. And that Sunday evening, as they were about to run up the white flag, Lew Wallace arrived and said, "No, take the flag down, we're going to fight." And the mayor said, "Well, how do we do that? All of our troops are gone. They're off in Kentucky fighting for the Union Army. We don't have cannons. We don't have defenses. What do we do?" And he said, "Cincinnati will defend itself." And he issued a martial law proclamation that every able-bodied man would carry a musket or a pick or a shovel or an axe. And they were all sent across that bridge in the foreground down there. That is the first bridge across the Ohio River. It was made by lashing together coal barges from the Licking River. And you can see in the background, all the way up there at the opposite side of the river and the Kentucky side next to that little riverboat, is the pier of the Roebling Suspension Bridge that was under construction before the war. And it wasn't finished until after the war. So that's the first bridge across the Ohio. Lew Wallace did that in 3 days. Not only that, he saved Cincinnati. He formed the first Black Brigade in the history of the Civil War, or anything in this country. He did it right here in Cincinnati. He sentenced the assassins of Abraham Lincoln when he sat on the military tribunal. He saved Washington, D.C. when nobody else believed that they were going to be under attack by Jubal Early, the Confederate general. He marched a bunch of clerks and paper pushers out of D.C. out to Monocacy, where he fought a battle vastly outnumbered and still managed to hold off Jubal Early long enough to save Washington, D.C. And then as territorial governor in New Mexico, he captured Billy the Kid. He put down the nation's biggest range war called the Lincoln County Range War. And he fought Geronimo and Victorio, 2 of the Indian renegades who were terrorizing all of the Southwest. And he also squelched that. And all in the spare time in the governor's mansion in Santa Fe, he is writing the American classic Ben-Hur. This is all the same guy. He also fought at Shiloh. He was an outstanding general, although he only went to school till he was about 8 years old. Everything he learned was stuff that he read. He was a painter, a musician, a sculptor, an inventor, and a writer, and a great writer. Now, Ben-Hur was the most popular book until about the 1920s. Only one book was more popular than Ben-Hur, and that was the Bible. It was such a popular book, even today, the movie Ben-Hur with Charlton Heston still shares the record for most Academy Awards. That's what a great story it is. And he did all of this. So that's the story of Lew Wallace. It's an amazing story. And then the latest book that I just brought out is called Promised Land. And that is the story of our first settlers who came here in the 1780s and settled on the banks of Ohio when all of this territory was known as the Miami Slaughterhouse. Most of the people who came down the river on flatboats were Revolutionary War veterans who could not be paid because the treasury was broke. So they told him, look, we can't pay you, but we'll give you some land in Ohio. And oh, by the way, the Shawnee and the Miami Indians believe that's their land. And not only that, they are the most vicious, frightening tribes in the whole country at that time, because even the Iroquois and the Mohicans, who were pretty tough themselves, would not go west because they were afraid to run into the Shawnee and Miami. So this is the story of those settlers and what it was like for them. For example, during one 4-year period, 1,500 of those settlers, women, children, brothers, fathers, uncles, wives, sisters, were taken by the Indians. They could be scalped on the spot where they would slowly die. They might be tortured or tomahawked. If they were tortured, they'd be taken back to the village where they would keep them alive for up to 4 days of slowly burning them to death. And that was for the entertainment of the tribe. Or they might be sold into slavery. The way that would happen is they would be forced to walk from the Ohio River all the way to Detroit in Michigan, where the British fort was. And there they would be sold to the British for $100 for each hostage. and the British would pay $50 for every scalp. And why were the British doing this? Well, they were trying to terrorize the new American colonies because they didn't want them to settle in the Northwest Territory because they eyed that for part of Canada. And the way they could keep that from being settled was to make it so horrible and dangerous to live there that people would just give up and go back east, and the whole United States would forever be abandoned to kind of a strip of land east of the Alleghenies. Well, there's a fantastic story of how that was stopped by George Washington and the man he sent to do it, and that story is the Battle of Fallen Timbers. After 2 attempts to put down the Indian Confederation and drive the British out of the Northwest Territory, he finally sent Mad Anthony Wayne, who fought the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The short version is he destroyed and splintered the Indian Confederation. He drove the British completely out of Ohio, and he destroyed the alliance between the British and the Indians. And then he established forts all through Ohio to protect future settlers, and he opened up all the states of the Northwest Territory for settlement. Those states today are part of the United States and not Canada because of that battle at Fallen Timbers. And that is all. And I'd be glad to take a few questions if anybody has some. Yes, sir.
At one time I worked for the city of Cincinnati at the municipal garage, and we used to contract out all our repairs for transmissions. Well, over by the brass ass was a transmission shop, and people wanted to know why all those Cincinnati police cars were over there by the brass, and they were just there for transmissions.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Well, they were. But the fact is, when you would drive by there, because they would park the cars on the street because they didn't have enough room in the lot for them.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. The stories are just hilarious, some of them, and some of them are pretty surprising, just how much corruption there actually was. And like Tom Stryker told this story about his captain in his precinct, and they used to laugh about how he would go out, and on Christmas Eve he would go out and make his rounds to collect all the goodies that all the bars would give him for Christmas presents. And he would fill his trunk of his car so much with booze, they swore that the front wheels were going to come off the ground. And great stories like that. Any other questions?
You answered everything. You were very, very good.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'll be up here signing books, and oh yes.
Peter, how long did all this research take you for not an hour challenge?
Yeah, I put about, the question was how much research, what's it take? I put about a year into each book. I will bring out my next one in November. That's going to be a collection of short stories. It'll be a lot like these stories, but more smaller sizes, and your travel size. And those will be coming out in November, but it takes me about a year. I've gotten better at it. The first one I spent about a year and a half, and then it got better and a little quicker after that. This is a great time for research because as a researcher now for books, I can find out in a matter of minutes what it used to take me days to find out as a reporter at the Inquirer in the old days. It's all a matter of finding the right places. For example, Forbidden Fruit, and not in our town, I relied on something called the FBI Vault. The FBI Vault is a place where classified documents go to die. They are going to be unclassified someday, it expires, but meanwhile they go into this vault and you can't see them. But if you file a Freedom of Information Act request, as I did, and plug in the right words like Beverly Hills Supper Club, Mo Dallas, Cleveland 4, all of these things, they will send you what nobody's probably ever seen before. Because those things are in there, but nobody has asked for them because they don't know where to find them. So I got, believe it or not, 3 compact discs full of information from the FBI. And among this were transcripts of unconstitutional, illegal wiretaps that Bobby Kennedy did in the Desert Inn in Las Vegas, where Mo Dallas and his henchmen were having meetings and where they talked about killing the Kennedys. I mean, this is amazing stuff, and it's all there in the FBI files, but nobody knows where to look.
Your talk fit right into the fact that we heard about the Beverly Hills fire last month.
Oh, good, good. Was that Bob Webster?
Yes.
Yeah, Bob's a friend of mine, and he's really good at this. His book is like the encyclopedia of the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire. And I cite it in my bibliography because he's done a heck of a good job on the research. But then in other ways, we go in different directions, but pretty much came to, I think, the same conclusion. This was not an accident. It was arson. And there's just overwhelming evidence for that. Okay, I'm going to sign books over here, and they're $20 a piece, and half of that will go back to Delhi Historical Society.